He was standing at the gate when the storm broke open again, as though the sky had been waiting for this specific man to arrive before it permitted itself to fall apart. The rain did not begin gently. It came all at once. A wall of cold water that hammered the iron gates of Kang Minjun's mansion with the indiscriminate violence of something that had no interest in the lives it was interrupting. And yet, the young man standing in it did not flinch. He stood with his chin level and his shoulders still, a sealed envelope pressed flat against his chest under one forearm, his other hand loose at his side. He was perhaps 30 years old. He was Nigerian. He was soaking. He was not afraid. Si Do-yoon saw him first on the security feed and came immediately to Minjun's study door without knocking. The third time in 14 months that he had done this, and each time, Minjun noted, had announced the arrival of something that would change the architecture of his world. Minjun was behind his desk. He had been reading, though in truth, he had not been processing the words for some time. He had been thinking about the letter in his inside pocket, the original letter, the one that had been tucked beneath a newborn baby in a yellow cloth on a stormy night 14 months ago. The one he had dried and folded and kept against his chest every single day since, the one that Adaeze Okonkwo did not know existed. When Do-yoon opened the door and said, "Boss, there's a man at the gate, Nigerian. He has a letter." Minjun did not ask whose letter it was. He did not need to. He had been waiting on some level for the second letter, the way a man waits for the confirmation of a diagnosis he already knows is coming. Not with surprise, but with the particular dread of certainty. He stood. He straightened his jacket. He said, "Bring him in. Then wake Adaeze, tell her it's important." He paused. "Tell her it's about her brother." Do-yoon's face showed nothing, because Do-yoon's face rarely showed anything. But there was the smallest hesitation before he nodded and left. Minjun watched the door close. He reached into his pocket and touched the edge of the original letter without removing it. He had been carrying it for 14 months. Tonight, he thought, might be the last night he could. Emeka in the doorway. Emeka Okonkwo was brought in through the side entrance, which meant he was walked through the back corridor past the kitchen, past Mrs. O's domain, past the door to the East Wing nursery where Hana slept. He did not know this geography. He walked through it anyway with the alert, measuring attention of a man cataloging everything he passed, not nervously, not like a person who feared the house, but like a person who had been trained to understand spaces and what they revealed about the people who inhabited them. When Do-hyun brought him to the study, the first thing Emeka did was look at the room, rather than at the man seated behind the desk. He looked at the books. He looked at the window. He looked at the framed map of Seoul on the far wall, and then he looked at Kang Minjun, and he said, in careful, accented Korean, "Thank you for letting me in." Minjun studied him. Emeka was lean and tall, with his sister's cheekbones and none of her restraint in his eyes. Where Adaeze managed her expressions with surgical precision, Emeka's face communicated in a richer currency, showing not what he felt but the fact of his intelligence, the active and continuous quality of his thinking. He was dressed in dark clothes, a heavy jacket that had gone dark with rain, a single bag over one shoulder. His hands were steady. The envelope he placed on the desk was damp at the edges but sealed, and the seal had not been broken. "You didn't read it," Minjun said. "It wasn't addressed to me." "Who gave it to you?" "A man who, by this time, is probably dead," Emeka said. He said it without drama, as a fact. Shin Jae-ho. I met him 3 weeks ago in a private hospital in Busan. He was not well. He knew he was not well. He said he had been looking for a way to reach someone in this house for months, and that I was the safest path he could find. He paused. He knew I was Adaeze's brother. He knew I was already coming. Minjun was quiet for a moment. Then, "How did you find her? How did you know she was here?" I've known where she was for 6 months, Emeka said. I chose not to come sooner. I needed to understand whether it was safe. His eyes met Minjun's without apology. I needed to understand you. There was a quality to the silence that followed. Not hostile, but weighted. The kind of silence two men sit in when they are deciding whether they are enemies. The rain continued against the windows. Then the door opened and Adaeze Okonkwo walked in wearing a dark robe, her hair loose around her face, and when she saw her brother standing in the middle of Kang Minjun's study, she went perfectly, completely still for the space of 3 full seconds. Then she crossed the room and held him, and said something in Igbo into his shoulder that no one else in the room could understand, and Emeka closed his eyes and held her back. And the two of them stayed like that for longer than the room expected. Minjun did not look away. He watched the reunion of two people who loved each other and had been afraid for each other, and he thought about the sealed envelope on his desk, and about the letter in his pocket, and about everything that was now, inevitably, beginning. What Shin Jae-ho wrote Minjun opened the envelope himself, at the desk, none with Adaeze seated across from him and Emeka standing at the window. The letter was 3 pages, written by hand in Korean, the characters uneven in places as though the hand that wrote them had not always been steady. Minjun read it in full silence before he spoke a word. He read it the way he read everything, completely, without expression, processing not just what was said but the architecture of what was omitted, the structure of a confession, and what that structure revealed about the confessor's state of mind. When he finished, he held the pages for a moment. Then he set them down and looked at Adaeze and said, I'm going to tell you what this says. I'm going to tell you all of it. I need you to listen without speaking until I've finished. She held his gaze. Tell me. He read it to her then, by translating from Korean into English as he went, keeping his voice flat and even. This is what Shin Jae-ho had written in the final weeks of his life, in a private hospital in Busan, with a conscience that had apparently decided it was not prepared to die quietly. I am writing this because I was a coward for a long time and I do not want to remain one past the end of my life. I did not act alone. I was a broker, a word I used because it is less ugly than the truth. The truth is that I was an instrument, and I allowed myself to be used, and the person I allowed to use me is a man named Emmanuel Okafor. He is 70 years old. He is one of the most powerful men in Lagos in Nigeria, and in several corridors of international influence I am not prepared to name in writing, but which you will recognize if you are paying attention. Okafor had one son. The son's name was Tobena. Tobena died 17 months ago in a road accident in Lagos, or what was described as a road accident, though Okafor has never fully accepted this description. Before Tobena died, he was involved with a young woman named Adaeze Okonkwo. I was the one who arranged this. I was paid to arrange it. I brought her to Korea on a fellowship that I controlled, and I introduced her to Tobena, though she never knew Tobena's family name or his father. To her, he was simply a man she met through a conference. The child she carries is Tobena Okafor's daughter. She is, therefore, the only living blood heir to Emmanuel Okafor's entire legacy. When Tobena died, Okafor learned about the pregnancy. He sent me to retrieve the child, and I told Adaeze what I was instructed to tell her, that the child would disappear, that she would disappear, that she should comply. I believed, at the time, that compliance meant safety. I was wrong. Okafor never intended to harm her. He intended to take the child and raise it as his heir, and Adaeze was collateral, a complication to be managed, not a person to be considered. The child is not simply a baby. She is, in the eyes of Emmanuel Okafor's estate, his legal successor. He has been searching for her since the night she was abandoned. He knows she is in Seoul. He has people here already. By the time you read this, if you are reading this at the right time, You may still have an opportunity to prepare. If you are reading it too late, God help you, because nothing else will. I am sorry. I know this is insufficient. But I have been a coward since the beginning of this, and I would rather die having said the truth than having said nothing. The child's name, if you want to know who she is in the world she was born into, is Chisom Okafor. In Igbo it means, God has answered my question. Her grandfather has not stopped asking his. When Minjun finished reading, the room was absolutely silent. The rain had quieted to something lower, almost patient against the glass. He looked at Adaeze. She had not moved. Her hands were in her lap, completely still, in the way of someone who has trained themselves not to show collapse, but whose body is doing something structural, some internal bracing that was visible to anyone who knew how to look. Emeka spoke first. He said, from the window, in a voice that was very careful, Ada, you need to tell him the rest. She turned to look at her brother. Something moved between them. Not a signal, not a warning, but the particular communication of two people who share a long, complicated history of protecting each other and have just arrived at the point where that protection has become impossible. Then she turned back to Minjun and said, There is a second letter. The storm letter, opened at last. The silence that followed those words was not the silence of surprise. It was the silence of a moment that both of them had been moving toward without naming. The kind of silence that accumulates in a space where someone has been carrying a secret and someone else has been carrying the knowledge of it. And they have both been waiting for the exact moment when the distance between those two facts became untenable. Minjun reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. He removed a folded piece of paper, aged now at the creases from 14 months of being carried, the edges softened from handling. He placed it on the desk between them without speaking. Adaeze looked at it. She looked at it the way a person looks at something they recognize from a time in their life they cannot fully access yet, with the slow, terrible knowledge of something familiar that they have been trying not to remember. Then she said very quietly, You kept it. Since the first night, Minjun said. I read it in the storm. I dried it. I kept it. He paused. I did not show it to you because I needed to understand it before I decided what to do with it. And then time passed, and I kept telling myself I was still deciding. I was not deciding. I was afraid of what it would do to what we had built. She looked at him for a long moment with an expression he had never seen on her face before. Not anger, not betrayal, but something more complex. Something that acknowledged that they had both been carrying things in silence, and that perhaps neither of them had the full moral authority to judge the other for it. She unfolded it herself. Her own handwriting, 14 months ago, written in the back of a car at 2 a.m. with a newborn baby on her chest, and a decision that could not be undone. She read it again now, here, in the warm light of his study, and what it said was this. This child's name is Chisom. She was born 4 days ago. She is healthy. She has done nothing wrong and deserves everything. I am leaving her here because I cannot keep her safe, and I cannot protect her where I am going. I chose this gate because I researched who lives behind it, and I believe, in the absence of better options, that fear is sometimes safer than love. Keep her from the man named Emmanuel Okafor. He will come. He always comes. My name is Adaeze Okonkwo, and I will come back for her when I can. Please do not let her forget that she was loved before she understood what love was. She folded it again when she was done. She did not cry. She held it in both hands and looked at the table, and she said, I wrote that knowing you might not read it, knowing you might simply call the police and have her taken into the system. I had a 30% chance, by my calculation, that you would keep her. I gave those odds to my daughter because I had nothing better to offer. You knew about Okafor, Minjun said, not accusingly, just establishing the fact. I knew his name, Emeka told me. He had found out who Tabena's father was, after Tabena died, after I was already pregnant, after Shin had already threatened me. Emeka came to Korea to warn me, but by then, I had already made the decision. She paused. I didn't know the full scale of it. I didn't know about the heir. I thought Okafor simply wanted the child, because she was his grandchild, and he was a man who owned things. He wants more than a grandchild, Emeka said from the window. He turned now and looked at both of them. He wants his entire legacy to continue. He has no other children. He has a financial empire worth approximately $4 billion on a political network across West Africa and parts of Europe, and enemies who have been waiting for him to have no heir. Hana, Chisholm, is not just sentimental to him. She is strategic. She is the continuation of everything he has built. Minjun absorbed this. He was quiet for the span of several breaths. Then he said, "And where does that leave us?" It was not a question. It was an honest acknowledgement of the shape of the problem. $4 billion, a political network, a grandfather who had been searching for 14 months and had, by Shin's own admission, people already in Seoul. And at the center of it all, a 14-month-old girl who, at this exact moment, was asleep in the East Wing with her thumb in her mouth and a stuffed rabbit tucked under her arm, entirely unaware that she had a name she had never been called, and a grandfather she had never met, and a world that had been waiting for her since before she was born. Emeka's true purpose. Emeka did not sit down for a long time. He stood at the window and he spoke, and what he said took 30 minutes and covered a great deal of ground. He spoke with the focused, layered delivery of a person who has been rehearsing this conversation for months and has decided that the only way through it is complete honesty, even the parts of complete honesty that do not reflect well on him. He had been, for the past 4 years, working for an organization that Minjun's people would probably classify as a competing power structure to Okafor's, a network of business people and officials in Lagos and London who had spent a decade trying to contain and eventually dismantle what they called Okafor's infrastructure. They were not noble people. They were people with their own interests who happened, on this particular issue, to want the same outcome as justice. They had sent Emeka to Korea not merely to find his sister, but to assess the situation and report back, and the report he was supposed to deliver included a recommendation about Hana, about whether she should be moved, secured, or, in the language his handlers had used, and that he had refused, neutralized as a leverage point. "I want you to understand what I mean by that," Emeka said, and his voice had changed, had lost its evenness and taken on something harder and more careful. They did not mean harm her. They meant remove her from the board. Put her somewhere Okafor could never find her, under a name no one knew, in a country no one would look. Make her disappear from the equation. She is not a piece on a board, Adaeze said. It was the first time she had spoken in several minutes, and her voice was very quiet and very absolute. "No," Emeka said, "she is not. Which is why I have not sent that report. Which is why I am here, in this room, telling you this instead." He looked at his sister. "I chose you. I chose her. I chose this. I want you to understand that it cost me something to do it." The room was still. Minjun was watching Emeka with the particular quality of attention he gave to people he was trying to measure, not for threat, but for truthfulness, which was a different kind of measurement entirely. He had, over the course of his career, become expert at identifying people who were telling the truth after a long period of telling versions of it. Emeka had the specific texture of a person in that process. "Who do you work for?" Minjun asked. Specifically, "A man named Victor Adeyemi, Lagos. He sits on 3 international boards and runs 2 foundations and is, beneath all of that, the primary architect of the effort to bring Okafor's network down. He is not a good man, but he is not trying to hurt Hana. And Okafor's people in Seoul? Emeka paused here, and Minjun knew from the quality of that pause that what came next was the thing Emeka had been building toward the entire conversation. There are two. One is a fixer, a man named Park Jung-yeon who has been in Seoul for 3 months under a cover in import logistics. He's been watching this house, recording movements. He's a professional, and he will act when he has his orders. A beat. The other is someone inside this house. Minjun's entire body became very still. Not the stillness of shock, the stillness of a predator who has just heard the specific sound they were dreading. Who? He said. One word. Zero inflection. Emeka looked at him. His name is Chanwook. He's been here for 7 months. He was placed by Okafor's network through a recruitment agency that seemed clean. He has been reporting household movements, the child's routine, entry and exit patterns. He doesn't know the full picture of why. He was recruited as a security consultant with an extra pay information arrangement. He thinks he's working for a private investigator. The silence after this was a different quality of silence entirely. It was the silence of a man who prides himself on the security of his world, discovering that his world has had a hole in it for 7 months. Minjun did not look toward the door. He did not raise his voice. He sat very still, and he looked at Emeka and he said, "How long have you known this?" 3 weeks. Since Busan. Shin gave me the name. And you didn't tell me when you arrived because I needed to be in this room first. I needed to know if you were someone I could tell. Another long silence. Then Minjun said, almost to himself, "Mrs. O was right about you." Emeka blinked. "You told Mrs. O about me?" "She told me about you. She said, 2 weeks ago, that the man at the gate would be the one who tells the truth we've been avoiding. I thought she was being dramatic." He stood up from the desk. "She is never being dramatic." The house with a hole in it. Minjun called Do-hyun at 3 in the morning. He did not explain over the phone. He said only, "Chanwook, his room, his phone, his records. I want everything before sunrise. Do not let him know." There was a pause. And then Do-hyun said, "Yes, boss," in the voice of a man who has just understood something painful about his own failures, and hung up. Do-hyun had recruited Chanwook. He had run the background check himself. He had vouched for him. What Minjun did not say and did not need to say was that this would cost Do-hyun nothing except his pride. Minjun had long understood that the most effective infiltrations were the ones that moved through legitimate channels, that the security failure was not Do-hyun's carelessness, but the fundamental vulnerability of any system that needed people to operate it. The fault was structural, but Do-hyun would not see it that way, and Minjun knew better than to argue with a man's conscience before it had finished processing. He sent Adaeze and Emeka to the sitting room with Mrs. O, who had appeared in the corridor at some point during the night and had simply begun making tea without being asked, as she always had, and presumably always would. He went to the nursery alone. Hana was asleep on her back in the position she had recently adopted, arms flung wide above her head, rabbit tucked under her left elbow, face completely abandoned to sleep in the way only babies and very old people achieve. Without reservation, without performance, without any of the guarding that adult sleep accumulates. She was 14 months old. She had recently begun pulling herself to standing against the crib bars and looking around with an expression of satisfied authority, as though she had decided the world was broadly acceptable and she was prepared to continue exploring it. Minjun sat in the nursing chair beside the crib. He did not turn on the light. He sat in the dark with the city glow coming through the edge of the curtain, and he looked at his daughter. He used the word without flinching now, had been using it internally for months, had in the last several weeks begun occasionally and privately using it externally, to Mrs. O, to Do-hyun, in the specific way of a man who is still practicing the sound of a truth he has already accepted. And he thought about a word he had read tonight in a dead man's letter. Chism. God has answered my question. He wondered what the question was. He wondered if it was the question every parent asks before the child arrives. Not the practical questions, but the deep, unanswerable one. Will I know what to do? Will I be enough? Will whatever is broken in me be visible to them? He thought about Emmanuel Okafor, 70 years old, sitting in Lagos with $4 billion and no one left to leave it to, asking his own version of that question across the enormous distance of blood and loss. He understood the shape of the man's grief, even if he refused to accept his claim. He thought, I would not have let her go either. And then he thought, but I was found worthy of her. That has to mean something. He sat with his daughter in the dark until Do-hyun knocked softly at 4:15 and held up Chan-wook's phone in a sealed evidence bag. Minjun stood. He kissed Hana's forehead, a gesture so practiced now that he no longer noticed he was doing it, which was perhaps the truest measure of how much had changed, and went back to work. What Chan-wook gave them. The phone contained 14 weeks of encrypted message logs between Chan-wook and an account registered to a company called Pacific Meridian Partners, which Minjun's analyst confirmed by 7 in the morning was a shell registered in Hong Kong with subsidiaries linking, through 3 intermediary structures, to a property holding group in Lagos. The messages were operational rather than personal. Times, movements, descriptions of routines. Who left the house? When the child was outside? Which windows faced the street? Whether there were patterns in Minjun's schedule that created gaps in coverage. Chan-wook had not, by the record of these messages, understood he was feeding surveillance to a man trying to reclaim a child. He had understood himself to be providing competitive intelligence for what he believed was a corporate due diligence operation connected to Minjun's business interests. He was not, in the language of the work, a true operative. He was a man who had been offered extra money for information and had told himself the category of his action was minor. It was not minor. It had given Park Jung-hyun, Okafor's actual professional on the ground in Seoul, 14 weeks of the household's rhythms. Minjun looked at the analyst's summary on his desk and then looked at Do-hyun and said, Where is Park Jung-hyun now? We're running the logistics company. We'll have an address within the hour. Good. Don't approach him. Locate and observe. I want to know everything he does before he does it. He paused. And Chan-wook? Awake. In his room. Does not appear to know he's been found. Keep it that way for now. He is more useful as a channel than as a confrontation. Minjun thought for a moment. But move Hana's schedule. Change the morning routine, the window coverage, the outdoor time. Make it look natural. Give Chan-wook inaccurate information to pass on. Make it plausible. Make it routine. But make it wrong. Do-hyun nodded. And there was in his expression the specific quality of a man who had been with Minjun long enough to appreciate the particular elegance of turning a problem into its own solution. Emeka, who had been sitting quietly in the corner of the study throughout this briefing with a cup of Mrs. O's tea, and the focused attention of someone who was recalibrating all their previous assessments in real time, said, You do this well. I've had practice, Minjun said. I'm beginning to understand why she chose your gate. Minjun looked at him for a moment. He said, She didn't only choose my gate because of my reputation. He picked up the refolded storm letter from the desk. She chose it because someone told her to. The letter says she researched who lived here. People don't research the specific gate of a specific mafia boss for a random safety gamble. Someone pointed her here. The room went quiet. Emeka set down his tea very carefully. He said, Yes. Who? Victor Adaeze, Emeka said. My handler. He knew about you. He knew about your particular ethical code, as far as children were concerned. He suggested it to me, and I suggested it to Adaeze. Minjun absorbed this. So, Adayeme's network has known where Hana is from the beginning. Yes. And he has not moved against Okafor in 14 months. No. Why? Emeka was quiet for a moment that told Minjun everything before the words did. Then Emeka said, because Hana being here, safe, unconfirmed as Okafor's heir, was useful to Adeyemi as long as Okafor was looking and not finding. A man searching is a man distracted. Okafor's network has made several missteps in the past year that Adeyemi's people have exploited. The search for Hana was, in Adeyemi's calculation, a strategic asset. The silence this time was comprehensive. Your sister, Minjun said slowly, was used as bait. Twice. By two different men on two different sides of the same conflict. Emeka said nothing. His jaw was tight. His hands on his knees were not entirely still. And you are here now, Minjun continued, because you decided you were no longer prepared to be the instrument of either of them. Yes, Emeka said. Minjun looked at him for a long time, then he said, all right, then we work together. But understand this clearly. If I discover at any point that you are running a calculation that involves my daughter's safety as a variable rather than a constant, this conversation will end in a way that neither of us will enjoy. He said it without heat, without performance, in the tone of a man stating a mathematical fact. Is that understood? Completely, Emeka said. The truth between two people. He found Adaeze in the nursery at 8 in the morning. She had gone there after the first briefing, and she had been there since. She was sitting on the floor beside the crib, her back against it, and Hana was in her lap now, awake and occupied with a set of wooden rings, completely absorbed in the project of trying to fit one inside another with an engineer's seriousness. Adaeze was watching her, with the specific expression she wore when she thought no one else was watching. Open, undefended, all the composure she maintained for public spaces quietly laid aside. Minjun stood in the doorway, and he said, she already knows something is different this morning. She's been unusually focused since 6. She picks up on atmospheres, Adaeze said, without turning. She has since she was very small. He crossed the room and sat on the edge of the nursing chair. They were close enough that when Hana looked up and saw both of them near each other, her face arranged itself into the expression she made when all the correct elements of her world were in alignment. A look of placid, complete satisfaction. She reached up and patted Adaeze's chin and then reached across and patted Minjun's knee, as though checking that they were both real and finding them acceptable, and then returned to her rings. They watched her for a moment in silence. Then Minjun said, I should have shown you the letter earlier. You should have, Adaeze agreed. She was not accusatory. She was honest, which was not the same thing. But I understand why you didn't. You weren't sure what it would displace. What it would displace, he repeated. What we had built. The arrangement, whatever this is. She gestured at the room, at the three of them in it, at the particular domestic universe that had grown up around them over the past 8 months, without anyone designing it. You were protecting it, which is what people do with things they value, even when protection becomes its own kind of dishonesty. He looked at her. Are you absconding me, or forgiving me? Neither. I'm understanding you. There's a difference. She paused. I kept things from you too. I didn't tell you about Emeka's work. I didn't tell you that I knew someone had pointed me to your gate. And I didn't tell you about Victor Adeyemi because I was afraid of what you would do with the information. And I was afraid that if I destabilized the arrangement I had inside these walls, I would lose the closest thing to safety Hana had found. She looked down at her daughter. We have both been keeping things to protect the same person. It's not noble. But it's not a betrayal either. It's just fear, wearing the clothes of strategy. He sat with this for a while. Hana had abandoned the rings and was now attempting to climb Adaeze's arm, which she treated as a personal mountain with considerable ambition. Outside, Seoul was going about its morning with the indifference of a city that has no investment in the private reckonings of its inhabitants. Then Minjun said, very quietly, "Her name, Chisholm." He said it carefully, as though trying it for the first time. "Did you know what it meant when you gave it to her?" Adaeze was quiet for a moment. "No, Tabena chose it. He told me the name the week before he died. He didn't know about the pregnancy yet, or I didn't think he did. He said, if I had a child, I would want to name her Chisholm." He said it like a wish. Her voice was steady, but her hands had tightened slightly on Hana's back. A month later, he was dead, and I was pregnant, and I didn't tell anyone. But I kept the name. It seemed wrong to take it back. She paused, and then I called her Hana, because that was the name he gave her. And she is both. She can be both. Minjun said, "She is both." They sat together in the morning light with the child between them, and the weight of everything that had happened and everything that was coming was present in the room, the way the quality of air before a storm is present, not yet arrived, but undeniable, already shaping the world it was about to enter. Enter Seo Yuna. She arrived on a Thursday afternoon under a name that was not hers, with documents that were not fake, which was the more dangerous variety of lie, because documents that are not fake are far more difficult to refuse. Her name, by the business card she presented to the gate intercom, was Seo Yuna, and her title was Senior Legal Counsel, and the law firm she named was real and prominent, and had no idea she was using it. She was Korean, 41 years old, and she stood at Minjun's gate in a charcoal wool suit with a structured briefcase at her side, and the particular quality of stillness that distinguished people who had been doing high-stakes work for a long time from people who were afraid. She was not afraid. She had a document folder under one arm. She said, to the intercom, in the precise Korean of someone educated at an extremely good institution, "I represent the Okafor estate. I'm here to discuss the child." Do-hyun watched her on the security feed for 45 seconds before calling Minjun. Minjun watched her for another 30. Then he said, "She came to the front gate. In daylight." "Yes, boss." "She wants to be let in." "Yes, boss." "Let her in." There was a pause. "Boss, the protocol." She came to the front gate in broad daylight with a briefcase and a business card. She is not here to harm anyone. She is here to talk." He paused. "People who come to harm you do not ring the intercom. Let her in. Take her briefcase. Check it completely. Bring her to the front sitting room. Do not bring her near the east wing." He was already buttoning his jacket when Emeka appeared in the study doorway and said, "There's a woman at your gate." "I know. She's connected to Okafor's legal network. The name she gave. It's a cover. Her real name is Seo Yuna, but she operates as a broker. Korean mother, Nigerian father. She moves between Lagos and Seoul. She has been the primary legal intermediary for Okafor's international arrangements for 12 years. Emeka's expression had shifted to something new, not fear, but its more focused cousin. She is extremely good at what she does. She will have documents that are legitimate. She will make an argument that is technically sound. She will be entirely reasonable right up until the point where she is not. Minjun straightened his cuffs. "Good. So will I." He had been walking toward the door when something stopped him. He turned back to Emeka and said, "You knew about her? From your handler?" "Yes." "Did you know she was coming to Seoul?" A pause that was very slightly too long. "I knew she had been tasked. I didn't know when." "All right." He looked at Emeka steadily. "Stay out of her sight line. She will recognize you. That complicates things in ways I'm not ready to manage yet." He turned and walked out. Then, from the corridor, "And Emeka, find Adaeze. Keep her with Hana. Keep them both in the east wing. No exceptions. The broker's offer. She was, as Emeka had said, extremely good. She sat across from Minjun in the front sitting room, with her hands folded over the document folder in her lap, and her posture that of someone who has decided to approach a difficult conversation as though it were an ordinary one. And she smiled at him in the way of a person who knows precisely where their own advantages lie, and is prepared to deploy them gently before deploying them otherwise. "Mr. Kang," she said, "I'll be direct, because I think you prefer that, and I think we're both too intelligent to enjoy the alternative. My client, Mr. Emmanuel Okafor, is aware that his granddaughter has been in your care for the past 14 months. He is grateful for that care. He does not intend to position this as a hostile situation. He has asked me to convey his personal appreciation for the welfare you have provided." "His granddaughter," Minjun said. "His son's daughter." "Yes. By a woman his son was placed with through a broker paid by Okafor's network." She blinked once, the tiniest recalibration. The history of how relationships form is rarely entirely clean. The facts of biology are not diminished by their context. That's a sophisticated way of describing what I would call a manufactured arrangement that resulted in a child whose mother was then threatened and coerced. My client is aware that certain parties acted with excessive force in managing the situation. He regrets that. He has, she paused, discontinued those relationships. "You mean Shin is dead?" She did not confirm or deny. She opened the document folder. "What I have here is a legal filing prepared for the Seoul family court, which asserts biological grandpaternal connection to the child currently registered as Kang Hana, and petitions for the initiation of a formal custodial review. This filing is correct in every material detail. It can be submitted today." She placed it on the table between them. "My client's preference is not to submit it. His preference is a private agreement. The child is returned to his care. The mother is compensated appropriately and relocated safely, and you are acknowledged, in whatever private arrangement we can construct, as someone who performed an extraordinary service that will not be forgotten." She said this last part with a quality that suggested "will not be forgotten" carried weight beyond gratitude. Minjun looked at the filing on the table. He did not touch it. He looked at it the way he looked at most weapons, with recognition rather than fear. Then he looked at Seo Yuna and he said, "You came here yourself. You didn't send someone. You didn't use Park Jung-yun." The smallest hesitation. She had not expected him to know that name. "I prefer to handle important conversations directly. Or you came yourself because you don't entirely trust Park Jung-yun to read the room correctly. Because this room requires a different kind of approach than force." He leaned forward slightly. "You're right about that. This room does require a different approach. But I'm going to save us both some time. There is no arrangement. There is no compensation. There is no private agreement. The child stays. Her mother stays. And if that filing arrives at the Seoul family court, what will also arrive at the Seoul family court is documentation that I have been assembling for the past 8 months relating to Emmanuel Okafor's network's activities in this country. Activities that are of significant interest to the Korean National Intelligence Service, with whom I have, from time to time, a working relationship." He paused. "One that it would surprise a number of people to know about." She was still. Her hands were still. But her eyes were doing something very busy behind their stillness. "I'm not your enemy, Ms. Seo," Minjun said, "but I am someone who has already decided how this ends. I'm giving your client the opportunity to decide whether he wants to be on the correct side of that ending, or whether he wants to find out what happens when I stop being patient." He stood. She stood. The courtesies of the powerful were observed between them. The small nods, the maintained eye contact, the absence of anything that could be read as submission on either side. At the door, she turned and said, "Mr. Kang, Okafor is not a man who accepts this kind of answer." "Neither am I," he said. After she left, he sat in the sitting room alone for 20 minutes after Seo-Yuna's car left the gate. Do-Yun came in at the 15-minute mark, stood against the wall, and did not speak. This was one of Do-Hyun's great professional qualities. He understood when Minjun's silence was productive and when it was dangerous, and this was the productive kind. The kind where a man who has been performing certainty in front of an opponent allows himself to sit with the actual complexity of the situation he has just navigated. The filing was real. Okafor's legal standing was real. $4 billion purchased extraordinary legal resources, and the Seoul family court, under sufficient institutional pressure, could be made to create significant complications. Minjun's counter-leverage was also real. He did have a relationship with the NIS, and he did have documentation, and Okafor's Korean operations were not invisible to parties who wanted to examine them. But legal battles took time, and during time, things happened. Children were vulnerable to time, to duration, to the accumulation of events that no one fully controls. He needed to accelerate the ending. He needed to make Okafor's calculation. Continue the legal effort in Korea versus absorb the exposure and withdraw. Tilt decisively toward withdrawal. To do that, he needed to give Okafor something to lose that was larger than what he was trying to gain. He called Emeka into the sitting room at the 30-minute mark and said, without preamble, "Adaeze, your handler. Can you reach him directly?" Emeka said carefully, "Yes." "Would he speak with me?" A pause. "He would be very interested in speaking with you." "Good. Set it up for tonight. Video call. Encrypted." Minjun looked at him steadily. "I want to end this in a way where Okafor has more to lose by pursuing us than by letting go. Adaeze wants to bring Okafor down. I want Hana safe. Those two objectives can be served by the same action if we align them correctly." Emeka said, "You're going to give Adaeze what he needs to destroy Okafor's network. I'm going to give him the material he has been looking for, and in return, he withdraws his interest in Hana as a strategic asset, publicly and permanently, in a form that removes her from the board on all sides. She becomes no one's leverage, she becomes a child." He paused. "The way she was always supposed to be." Emeka was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "What do you want from me?" "In this arrangement, genuinely." Minjun looked at him. "I want someone who knows both sides of this world to stay close to this family while we navigate what's coming. Someone Adaeze trusts. Someone who isn't running a calculation about the child's strategic value." He held Emeka's gaze. "I want someone who chose correctly when it cost them something. Those people are rarer than they should be." Emeka was quiet for a moment longer. Then he said, "My sister is going to say you're recruiting me." "Your sister?" Minjun said, almost to himself, with the specific expression of someone who has been outmaneuvered by someone they respect, says a great many accurate things. Adaeze in the garden. She took Hana to the small garden inside the eastern courtyard that afternoon, the private garden, invisible from the street, accessible only from the east wing. It was cold but bright, the kind of late autumn afternoon that arrives in Seoul like an apology for the rain, and Hana was bundled to the point of comedy, a small round figure in a padded suit that made independent movement difficult, but which she was navigating with considerable determination, holding the edge of the low garden wall and moving along it with the triumphant gait of a person who has recently discovered legs and finds the entire concept extraordinary. Adaeze watched her from the stone bench. She had been thinking about Tabena all morning. She had not let herself think about him in a sustained way for a long time. She had filed him in the category of things she couldn't afford to visit, not because she didn't love him, but because loving him and being unable to grieve him properly while she was afraid had created a pressure she couldn't manage in real time. Now, with Shin's letter telling her things she hadn't known, she was sitting with the full picture of it. A young man who had been placed beside her by his father's broker, who had not known he was an instrument, who had named a child he didn't know existed, who had died before he could know that his wish had been granted. She felt the grief of that with a clarity and completeness she hadn't been able to access before, and she let it come. Sitting in the cold garden while her daughter navigated the wall, and it moved through her the way honest grief moves. Fully, terribly, and with the specific mercy of things that, once felt completely, diminish. Minjun came into the garden at 4 o'clock. He sat on the bench beside her without speaking. Hana saw him immediately and let go of the wall, a decision made with complete confidence and imperfect execution, resulting in a controlled topple onto her well-padded seat, and looked at him with an expression that clearly communicated, "I meant to do that." He went to her, lifted her, and carried her back to Adaeze before sitting again. For a long while they said nothing. Hana, recalibrated, was now investigating the garden stones with the forensic attention she brought to all new surfaces. Then Adaeze said, "Tell me what you're planning." He told her. All of it. Adaeze, the alignment of interests, the legal counter-leverage, the plan to remove Hana from the board on all sides. He spoke for 10 minutes, and she listened without interrupting, the way she listened when she was doing more than listening, when she was modeling the future and testing its structural integrity against everything she knew. When he finished, she said, "It could work. It should work." Those are different statements. Yes, he acknowledged. They are. She looked at her daughter. Hana had found a small, smooth stone and was holding it up to the sky with the particular satisfaction of someone who has discovered a treasure. The afternoon light caught it and Hana turned it slowly, watching the light move with an expression of pure, uncomplicated wonder. Adaeze watched her and thought, "This is what we are protecting. Not a strategy, not a leverage point, not an heir to anything. This exact face making this exact expression in this light." "There's something else," Minjun said. She turned to look at him. He was looking at the garden wall, not at her. He had the expression of a man preparing to say something he has been composing for some time. When this is over, when Okafor has been neutralized, when the legal risk is resolved, when Hana is safe in the way we both mean, when we say the word safe, you'll have a choice. You'll have stability. Emeka is here. The threat is reducible. You can take her and build a life that isn't shaped by this house, and what it contains, and what I am. He paused. I want you to know that I won't obstruct that. And if you decide the right thing for her is a different life, a quieter one without the particular complications of my world, I will find a way to let you go that doesn't take anything from her. The silence was long and of an unusual texture. Adaeze said, "Are you telling me you're giving me an exit?" "I'm telling you that you have one. Whether you use it is entirely your decision." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she turned back to her daughter, who had put the stone down and was now attempting to eat a leaf, and said, "When this is over, ask me again. I'll give you a real answer then." She stood to retrieve the leaf from Hana's hand. "But for what it's worth, I stopped looking for exits about 6 months ago." She took the leaf. Hana looked at her with enormous, outraged eyes. Adaeze kissed her forehead. Minjun, still seated on the bench, looked at the middle distance with an expression that Mrs. O, had she been present, would have recognized immediately as the expression of a man who was only barely managing not to look like someone whose answer had just mattered enormously to him. Victor Adaeze on a screen. The call happened at 11 at night, encrypted and routed through 3 servers. The screen showed a man in a Lagos office, 60-something, silver at his temples, an expensive suit, and the controlled, watchful face of someone who has spent decades operating in the space between legitimate power and what power actually requires. Victor Adaeze was, as Emeka had described, not a good man. but he was a specific kind of not good man. The kind who has replaced moral instinct with strategic logic so thoroughly that he has become, in a paradoxical way, predictable, which meant he was manageable. Minjun spoke to him for 40 minutes. Emeka was present but did not speak. The offer Minjun made was precise and without sentimentality. He had documentation on Okafor's Korean operations, financial flows, political contacts, 3 specific transactions that constituted money laundering on an international scale, and that, combined with the material Adeyeme's network already held, would be sufficient to initiate the kind of multi-jurisdictional investigation that Okafor's organization could not survive. He would provide this material. In exchange, Adeyemi would make a specific and documented communication to Okafor's legal team, confirming that the child known as Hana was outside the scope of any ongoing dispute and would not be pursued through any channel, legal, political, or otherwise, by any party connected to Adeyemi's network. This communication would be structured in a way that Okafor would understand, meant Adeyemi would expose the heir arrangement publicly if the child was touched. "You're making Hana radioactive to both sides simultaneously," Adeyemi said. "I'm making her invisible," Minjun said. "Which is a different thing." Adeyemi was quiet for a moment. "And Emeka's continued position in my network?" "Emeka makes his own choices. I'm not his employer. He chose to come to you. He chose to protect his family. You should consider whether that's something you want to work with or against." Minjun paused. "He's extremely effective. I've observed him for 36 hours under significant pressure. He's the best judge of a room I've encountered in considerable time. That is a resource a man in your position should prefer to keep, rather than lose." Adeyemi looked at something off-screen for a moment. Then he looked back. "The documentation. In your secure inbox within 48 hours of the written communication regarding the child. 48 hours is aggressive. I have an aggressive timeline. Seo Yuna is in Seoul. Park Jung-hyun is in Seoul. I have approximately 1 week before Okafor moves from legal approach to direct approach, and a direct approach in this house ends badly for everyone, including your timeline." Adeyemi was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You love the child?" Minjun did not respond immediately. When he did, he said, "The documentation will be in your inbox." It was, by Minjun's standards, a confession. What Park Jung-hyun did next. The call had gone well. The documentation was prepared. The communication from Adeyemi to Okafor's legal network was being drafted. Minjun had 7 days, and 6 of them looked manageable. It was the 7th that undid things, because it was not the 7th day. It was the 2nd night, and Park Jung-hyun had not received the memo about timelines. The breach happened at 2:47 in the morning. It was not loud. That was the worst part. It was not loud, and it was not visible on the security system because Chan-wook, still not knowing he had been discovered, had passed on the information Minjun had deliberately given him about the night staff rotation and the camera schedule. That information had been wrong in every material detail, and so Park Jung-hyun, who was a professional with 14 years of operational experience, he found himself inside the wrong configuration entirely. Interior lights where he expected dark, staff where he expected gaps, a door locked that he had been told would be open. He made it as far as the East Wing corridor before Do-hyun and Seojun were on him. There was no silence about that part. Minjun was out of bed and in the corridor in 40 seconds. Adaeze was out of her room in 30. They reached the East Wing intersection at almost the same moment and stood 3 feet apart looking at Do-hyun restraining a man in dark tactical clothes against the far wall with the efficient brutality of someone who has done this before and feels nothing about it. The house was awake. Every light was on. Mrs. O appeared at the kitchen end of the corridor with a ceramic rolling pin and an expression that Minjun would remember for years as the most perfectly composed look of intention he had ever seen on a human face. Adaeze went to the nursery door. She opened it. Hana was awake. The sounds had woken her, and was sitting up in her crib with her rabbit and her expression of large-eyed, fully alert morning face. The expression she wore when she had decided it was time for the world to begin regardless of what the clock said. She looked at her mother in the doorway and lifted both arms. Adaeze picked her up. She held her so tightly that Hana, who was generally tolerant of intense physical affection but had her limits, pushed against her shoulder with both hands and made the sound she made when she considered herself to have been held long enough. Adaeze loosened slightly and said, in Igbo, something that meant, I know, baby. I know. I'm sorry. You're all right. Minjun, from the corridor, heard this. He looked at the man Do-hyun was holding, middle-aged, controlled even now, giving away nothing. And he felt something moving in him that he had not felt in a very long time. Not the cold, operational clarity of threat management. Something older. Something that had been growing in him since the night 14 months ago when the storm brought the first impossible thing to his gate. And that tonight had fully arrived and had a name and was not going back to wherever it had been before he discovered it. He said to Do-hyun, very quietly, take him to the lower level. I'll be down in 20 minutes. Then he walked to the nursery door. Adaeze turned, still holding Hana. Hana, seeing Minjun, immediately lunged toward him with the directional certainty of someone who knows exactly where they want to be and expects the universe to accommodate. Adaeze transferred her. Hana grabbed Minjun's collar and settled against his chest and closed her eyes with the comprehensive satisfaction of someone who has decided all the relevant variables are in order and she can go back to sleep now. Minjun and Adaeze stood facing each other in the doorway holding a child between them, and Adaeze said, very quietly, we need to finish this faster. I know, he said. Whatever it takes. Whatever it takes, he confirmed. Chanwook. He came to Minjun at dawn. He did not wait to be summoned. He arrived at the study door and he knocked, and when Minjun said, come in, he entered and stood with his hands at his sides, and his face arranged in the expression of a man who has understood something about himself in the dark hours and has not yet decided whether to continue living with it. You know, Chanwook said, not a question. For 3 days, Minjun confirmed. Chanwook's jaw moved. He was in his late 20s, a lean, careful young man who had come to this household through Do-hyun's referral and had, for his first 5 months, been exactly what he appeared to be, diligent, attentive, completely competent. The extra money had come through a message on an app he used for freelance security work. He had told himself it was research for a corporate client. He had not asked enough questions, because the money was enough that asking questions felt like a risk he didn't need to take. The child, he said. I didn't know it was about the child. I know you didn't. The information I passed, did it. He stopped. He looked at the floor. Last night. Was that because of me? Minjun looked at him for a long moment. Not directly. The man who came last night used inaccurate information. Information I provided to you specifically to be passed on. He walked into a different house than the one he thought he was entering. A pause. He is currently in my lower level and is having a very instructive morning. Chanwook looked up. You used me. I used the fact that you had been used without knowing it. Those are different things. Minjun studied him. The question I'm asking you is the same one I ask everyone who stands in that spot. What do you do with the knowledge of what you did? Some people justify it. Some people minimize it. Some people run. He paused. What are you going to do? The room was quiet. Chanwook was not a man with great practice at this kind of reckoning. He was a practical person, trained in logistics and security work, not in moral accounting. but he had been in this house long enough to have heard Hana cry from the east wing, to have seen what it did to Minjun's face when he held her, to have understood, in the cumulative way you understand things in close quarters with people, that whatever he had been part of was not abstract. And it had a small face and a rabbit, and a tendency to look at people as though she was deciding something important about them. "I'll do whatever you ask," Chanwook said, "to fix it." "There are things that can't be fixed," Minjun said, "only redirected." He looked at the young man steadily. "Go talk to Do-hyun. Tell him everything. The account, the messages, the name on the app. All of it. Then I'll tell you what comes next." After Chanwook left, Minjun sat with the particular feeling of a man who has been in a world defined by loyalty and betrayal for a long time, and has never entirely lost the capacity to be disappointed by human weakness, even while understanding it completely. It was not anger. It was something more tired than anger. Something that knew the shape of how people fail each other and had simply decided that the only meaningful response was to keep going. Then the message that came back. Adaeme's communication to Okafor's legal team arrived on a Friday morning, 4 days after the call. Minjun read it twice. It was precise, it was correct in its legal language, and it was structured exactly as he had specified. A permanent, documented withdrawal of any claim to or interest in the child currently known as Kang Hana, accompanied by the implicit and unmissable message that the alternative to compliance was a document release that would end Emmanuel Okafor's empire in 3 jurisdictions simultaneously. Seo Yuna called the mansion at noon. She asked to speak to Minjun. Do-hyun handed him the phone. "I've received new instructions from my client," she said. She said it in the flat voice of a professional who is managing her own response to a significant defeat and will not let it be audible. "He wishes to withdraw all legal proceedings and discontinue active interest in the Korean situation." "I'm pleased to hear it," Minjun said. "He asks. And I want to be clear, this is a request, not a demand. Whether, at some future time, he might be permitted to know that the child is healthy and well." Minjun was quiet for a long moment. He thought about Emmanuel Okafor, 70 years old, a man who had lost his son, who had used terrible means to pursue what was, at its base, a human grief. He thought about how much damage unchecked power did to the people who wielded it and the people who got in its way. He thought about whether the architecture of a generous answer was possible here, while in the presence of so much that was not generous. He said, "That is a conversation for another time, and for someone other than me to decide." He paused. "But it is not a closed question." He handed the phone back to Do-hyun. He walked to the east wing. Through the nursery door he could hear Adaeze and Hana. Hana's rising, demanding vocalization, which was her current communication method for everything from hunger to the philosophical problem of objects that had fallen out of reach, and Adaeze's voice underneath it, calm and answering. He stood at the door for a moment without opening it. He let himself feel the weight of the past 4 days lift, partially, in the specific way that not quite resolutions feel. Not clean, not finished, but shifted. A different configuration of the same forces, yet a configuration in which the child at the center had more space around her than she had yesterday. He knocked. Adaeze said, "Come in." He opened the door. Hana, on the floor with a collection of objects she was sorting by some taxonomy visible only to herself, looked up at him. She held up a small blue block in his direction, with the specific expression she used when she had found something she considered valuable, and wished to share the value of it with him. He crossed the room, sat on the floor beside her, and accepted the block. He turned it over in his hands and said to Hana, with complete seriousness, "This is a good one." Hana appeared satisfied. She returned to her sorting. Adaeze watched them from the nursing chair. She said, "Is it done?" "For now," Minjun said. "The immediate threat is contained. Okafor will pull back. He will not go quietly. Men like him don't. But the calculus has changed, and he knows it. And Adeyemi? Adeyemi got what he needed. He will use it. Okafor's network will be under significant pressure within 6 months. He paused. The investigation won't touch us. I made sure of that. She nodded. Hana had abandoned the blocks and crawled to Minjun and was now pulling herself upright against his knee with the determination of someone training for a significant athletic event. He steadied her automatically, both hands ready at her sides, and she stood, successfully, triumphantly, for a full 6 seconds before sitting down again and looking at both of them with enormous satisfaction. She stood, Adaeze said. She stood, he agreed. They looked at each other across the room with an expression that neither of them named, because it did not need a name, because it had been building for long enough that its arrival was not a surprise, but a recognition, the particular feeling of something that was always going to be true, making itself known at last. The third letter. 3 weeks later, on an ordinary evening when the city had settled into its autumn quiet and the East Wing nursery had the specific warm hum of a house where a child has recently been put to bed and the adults are finally allowed to be still, Minjun was in his study when Emeka knocked and entered. He was holding a single envelope. It had not come through any of Minjun's channels. It had been delivered, Emeka explained, by a courier to the office Adaeze now formally occupied at the consultancy. A courier who had been traceable briefly to an address in Lagos and then to nothing. The envelope was addressed to Adaeze, but inside there were 2 letters. One was for her. One was for Hana, sealed separately, labeled in Igbo in an old man's handwriting, for my granddaughter, to be opened when she is ready to know who she is. Adaeze sat with both letters for a long time. She did not open the one addressed to Hana. She set it carefully in the small wooden box she kept on the bookshelf in the nursery. The box she had placed there months ago with no clear purpose, as though some part of her had known it would eventually be needed. The letter to herself she read once, alone, at midnight, with Minjun sitting in the chair across the room, not reading it but present, which was the only thing she had asked for. She did not tell him that night what the letter contained. She told him only, he let go. For now, Minjun said. For now, she agreed. And then, after a moment, he knows her name. He says it in the letter. He says it in Igbo. Her voice was controlled, precisely controlled, in the way it was when something had reached far enough into her to require the full architecture of her composure to manage. He says, I named my son Tabena, which means the father is excellent. My son named his daughter Chisum, which means God has answered my question. I do not know what the question was, but I know that whatever it was, it deserved a better answer than the one I gave it. The room was quiet. The city moved beyond the windows, indifferent and alive. He's still dangerous, Minjun said. Yes. The withdrawal was strategic. Yes. It was also... She paused. Something else. And people can be strategic and also mean something. Those aren't mutually exclusive. He looked at her. She looked at him. They were both thinking about the letter in the wooden box, sealed, waiting for a child who was right now asleep in the next room and was 15 months old and could say 4 words and was learning, with extraordinary seriousness, how to walk. A letter from a man she had never met, who had made choices that had shaped the entire architecture of her existence before she existed, who had tried to reclaim her with all the wrong methods, and had, somewhere in the private country of 70 years of living, arrived at something that looked, if not like remorse, then at least like its first cousin. When does she get to decide? Adaeze said. What she wants to know about him. About all of it. When she's old enough to ask the questions that deserve the answers, Minjun said. We'll know when that is. How? He paused. Because she'll ask them. She has been asking questions since she was 6 weeks old. She has just been asking them without words. He looked toward the nursery door. When she has the words, nothing is going to stop her. Adaeze smiled. A real smile. The kind she gave rarely and without warning. The kind that arrived and left so quickly it was easy to doubt you'd seen it unless you were watching for it. And Minjun, by this point, was always watching for it. She stood and said, "I'm going to check on her. She's asleep. I know. I'm going to check on her anyway." She left the room. He listened to her footsteps in the corridor and the soft sound of the nursery door opening, and the particular silence of a person standing over a sleeping child and watching them breathe in the dark. He looked at the window, at the city beyond it, at the iron gate visible at the edge of the property lights. That gate, that specific iron gate, through which the world had been sending him things he didn't know he needed, one rain-soaked delivery at a time. He thought he was, finally, nearing something that could be called peace. He thought the scale of the threat had been reduced to something manageable. He thought, as he had thought many times before, that the worst was probably behind them now. Then his phone vibrated. It was Do-hyun. The message was 4 words. "He is in Seoul." Minjun read it once. He set the phone down on the desk. He put both hands flat on the surface and looked at the middle distance for a long, still moment. Then he picked the phone up again and typed, "How long?" The response came in seconds. 3 days. Came through Incheon on a private manifest. He is not alone. He has a full security detail. He is in a private residence in Hanamdong. He has not made contact. He is waiting. Minjun typed, "For what?" A long pause. Then, "Unknown. But boss?" He brought someone with him. A doctor, specialized in pediatrics, and a Korean family law attorney, one of the best in the country. Minjun stared at the screen. Emmanuel Okafor was in Seoul. He had withdrawn his legal filing. He had written a letter that sounded like the beginning of an ending. And then he had come anyway, with a pediatric doctor and a family lawyer and a security detail, and he was sitting in a house in Hanamdong 3 kilometers from this one, and he was waiting. Not moving. Waiting. The gate at the edge of the property light stood as it always had, iron, enormous, patient. The city moved behind it. The rain, somewhere distant, was beginning again. Kang Minjun stood up from his desk. He walked to the nursery. He stood in the doorway. Adaeze was there, as he had known she would be, sitting on the floor beside the crib with her back against it in the dark, watching Hana sleep with the expression she only allowed herself when she believed she was unobserved. Hana was on her back, arms flung wide, rabbit tucked under one elbow, chest rising and falling in the perfect rhythm of complete and innocent peace. He showed Adaeze the phone. She read the messages. She read them a second time. She handed it back without speaking. Then she looked at their daughter for a long time. And then she said, "He came himself." "Yes." "What does that mean?" Minjun was quiet for a moment. "It means the calculation we made is no longer the calculation we're dealing with. This is something different." He paused. He came to see her. Adaeze closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them, they were clear and steady, and looking at something he could not see. "What are we going to do?" Kang Minjun looked at the child in the crib. He looked at the woman on the floor beside it. He thought about a letter in a wooden box. He thought about names and what they meant, and what a man of 70 might feel, sitting 3 kilometers away in the dark, waiting to be told what version of this story he was allowed to be part of. He said, "I don't know yet." It was the most honest thing he had said in a very long time, and it was the sentence that every part of what came next would hang on. The weight of a man admitting that the thing in front of him was larger than his expertise, more complicated than his strategy, more human than his world had previously required him to be. The city breathed outside. The rain arrived. The gate waited, as gates do, for what was coming next.